Hi there everybody, Patricia Windrow once again at the Cable Easel with a program which is a demonstration of painting from life. When there is a possibility to bring life subjects into the studio, I do that. But when it is a question of painting the Long Island scene, the innovation here has been to take tapings of these scenes of my choice and running it on a monitor here in the studio, which means that it's the closest thing that you can get, but there's all the comforts of home, namely the proper lights and the proper cameras and the proper technical facilities. So today, at this time, this program is a wonderful architectural gem, which is in the eastern end of Long Island, in a place, to be specific, called Northville. Anybody who knows the eastern end of Suffolk County knows that Northville is about 5 to 10 miles beyond the Long Island Expressway, and it is northeast of Riverhead. The address, of course, of this church, which is called the First Parish Church, Congregational Church of Riverhead, is located in the town of Northville. It was built in 1902, which makes it something of a vintage structure, but it is a replacement for two churches that were burned on that site since probably the middle of the 19th century. There were two churches here before they burned, and I believe that the church across the street was built in 1831. It's now the parish hall. This is all from the town historian, a Mrs. Wells, who was extremely helpful to give us all this information. The minister's name is Robert Palin, and periodically throughout these 2.5 hours, which is what this is going to take, I'm going to talk a little bit briefly and maybe even repeat myself to tell you a little bit about this church, my feelings of it, and the fact that it is right there on the main street for anyone to go and visit if they happen to be passing through that area. Because it is an architectural problem, I have done a slight amount of sketching beforehand. As you can see, there are tremendous angles, wonderful rectangles and squares and arches and triangles involved in this piece, and like Julia Child, I prepared some of it ahead of time. We all know that Julia Child does all that roasting and baking and sauteing beforehand and sticks it in the refrigerator so that you can see it finished. Well, I found it necessary to do some planning of this. I will redo it for you a little bit more visibly and explain it as I go along about points of reference. But this is only a 1.5 hour program for part one. Part two will come in the next one. The first thing, of course, to do is to find the uppermost structure in this complex of forms, because the uppermost structure is going to determine the height of it and therefore the size of the rest of them. This is all architecturally very difficult. I am assuming that this is probably going to be more an entertainment show or a travel log than it is going to be an instructional program of how to paint this particular church. The need to be able to draw is evident here. As you can see what I'm doing when I'm laying over my pencil sketch, I'm trying to explain what I'm doing at the same time. All things in perspective run a certain way, and they all have to a vanishing point. Actually, when you draw something like this out, you have to assume that you have the vanishing point in your mind. I am not intending either to present to you an architectural rendering of this. This is supposed to be a painting with a little bit of art included and a little bit of atmosphere and a little bit of personal feeling about how to render these particular structures, but you find out about about the problems only as you do them. Naturally, the points of reference are that this roof line comes at approximately the lower part of this roof line. And so if anybody who is genuinely watching this with great interest of how you do this kind of a thing, I will just briefly mention the points of reference. The triangle runs approximately the middle of this particular tower, and it is a true isosceles triangle that is at a little bit of an angle because we are seeing this in three-quarter view. All of this may seem extraordinarily complicated, but if you set yourself to the task of doing something like this, you have to deal with the complications or just pass them by and go and find a beach to paint. However, this was the selection for this program, and doing an architectural painting once in a while is important. There's a lot to be said for doing these things. It's a reporter's reference, as a matter of fact, because having mentioned to you before that the church that was, the two churches that stood on this site are now no longer around, and if you were watching this program for any amount of time, you know that the opening of my program of the Cable Easel shows a house on stilts in a creek in Setorkit. And that is no longer existing. It burned last year. So the recording of these architectural pieces is somewhat vital for the historical sense. This church looks very solid. We are not suggesting that anything could happen to it, but if paintings and photographs and drawings of these places are done, then there is also a historic reference to these pieces. The only reason that we know that how Van Gogh looked before the age of photography was the fact that he did his self-portrait so many times. The same thing goes for people like Jacques-Louis David, and Michelangelo did himself in stone and in paintings in the Sistine Chapel. So painters are actually recorders of history in a certain sense. And maybe we are now recording the architecture of this building for future reference, possibly. There is a very large chimney here. I think you will find that if you observe the local and modern churches today, there is probably no evidence of a chimney, which tells you that at the time this was built, there was a need for a chimney for a heating system. Now it's possible that the lack of chimneys is either camouflaged or the churches are heated by oil burners that have very small and not very visible flues. But this chimney here is quite large. There is a nice little peak on this one. There's a peak which disappears on this one. Shouldn't have. I should have set it a little bit further down. Too late for that now. And here is the general laying out, and this must be done in order to be able to get any kind of decent rendering of this church as you go along. This is, of course, the perfect time of year because all of these remarkably beautiful and very colorful azalea bushes are out front, and who can resist a white church against a blue sky with blooming azaleas in front of it? There is no question that that is a very wonderful composition and subject for a painting. The big dramatic tree that comes over and kind of frames the composition is over here on the right side, and it's going to be, I'm going to probably render it purely in a silhouette form. And then there is another maybe even overly romantic addition here. There is a blooming white dogwood. It almost it's as if somebody had planned this for the ultimate romantic painting of a church. I've sketched in the angles of the shadows because they are going to be as important as the drawing as the painting of it. The shadows on this particular composition tells you the time of day, tells you that the angles are giving you some information which you wouldn't have if it weren't for the shadows. I believe this is early morning because we are northeast, and the sun is coming from the right side, which means that it's obviously an easterly sun. The town historian, Mrs. Wells, was extremely helpful with all this information, which we managed to receive at the very last minute. And so here's a person who is right there on the spot with the information to be gotten by the phone. If you care any more about this particular church, you might know that somewhere in the town of Northville there is a lady called Mrs. Wells who will probably be more than gracious, as she was to us, to tell you anything further that you may want to know. Corner of Church Avenue and Church Lane and Sound Avenue in Northville. All right, this is laid out. It looks very complex. We're going to try and simplify it because this is not, after all, a show to bore you to death. So let's start, as I usually do, with the places that are the furthest away, and that is on this clear and late spring sky of pure, uninterrupted blue, not a cloud in sight, and pure as it may seem, as it possibly can get. A touch of ultramarine blue should probably do it. I'm mixing it on the palette enough to be able to cover, and it's actually quite brilliant. I should probably have a touch of Prussian blue in there to make it as brilliant as it is. When Long Island decides that it's going to have a clear sky, I don't suppose that there's anything quite as clear as a Long Island sky. We must be extremely fortunate with the trade winds being what they are, or the winds going from west to east and clearing out as it gets to the eastern end of Long Island, whereby the clarity here is quite it's very telling. When I do these paintings of Long Island in crystal clear skies, it is unmistakably this island. I've been living in Virginia. There are clear skies, of course, down there periodically, quite often, but they are not the same type of clarity, because the mountains have a great deal to do with how the skies remain. There is a certain misty quality to the skies down there, with rare exceptions. Sometimes there are tremendously clear days, such as this one. But the color scheme of a pure white sunlit church with the deep shadows and the blooming azaleas in the front are a color scheme which almost paints itself. We have to kind of admit that color schemes are very important when you're dealing with paintings. I don't think that it would be, maybe with the exception of this church in the middle of a newly fallen snow, would be equally as interesting, not as contrasty, but equally as interesting to see the brilliantly white church with no green relief and no other colors from the bushes. But this is the ultimate acceptable and fascinating color scheme of an architectural painting. I don't know whether or not architectural paintings are of interest to people who don't get involved in painting architectural things, but the Metropolitan Museum in New York is absolutely jammed full of classic architectural paintings of architecture. Every time anybody went to Paris, they always produced some kind of a painting of the architecture of Paris, and the same thing goes for Berlin and London and Italy and Rome and all these things. So painting buildings has always been of interest to painters. Except I could mention a number of contemporary painters, Modigliani, who painted those very wonderful long-necked people in Paris at the turn of the century, couldn't have cared less about architecture. He was interested in people. But Van Gogh was interested in architectural renderings, as were many of the British classic painters. And the Americans have been painting buildings for these 300 years that we have been here settling this land. So here we are with a favorite American artistic pastime, rendering buildings. As you can see, while I've been talking to you about that, I've been filling in this clear, cloudless sky of blue. The first thing that you do when you paint out of doors is to get the distance in first. I had something of a time drawing this. I had to remember all my rules of perspective and all my information that I have accumulated with these years and years of painting, because if you don't get it right, you risk having what happened to me once on a show here during a live show. I had done what I thought was a perfectly acceptable drawing of a barn, and I'd forgotten one of the windows, and I had a very courteous and gentle man call me up and say very solicitously, "Did you forget one of the windows?" And of course that's the kind of thing that one remembers forever, that you forgot one of the windows. How can you forget it if you're working from life? Anyway, so I drew this and took a moment to really try and get it architecturally acceptable, so that it isn't askew, so that things are actually where they ought to be, because as a painter of actual places, you want to make sure that the place is recognizable above all else. Now, that has all been rendered, taken care of. The blue is in. It is probably the only tedious part of covering large masses, except that there is a certain interest in getting it to have an interesting stroke. Instead of having great long sweeping lines, I like to sort of give it a texture. Texture is what I was after in this painting that's behind me here of the mountain after a blizzard, and all of that texture is evident in the way I applied the color. A lot of that color is done only by brush. All right, we have here the silhouette of this wonderful First Parish Church in Northville, Long Island, New York. Now comes the application of the white and the shadows. The rest of it is going to probably paint itself. But remembering that the color comes from the east side, I mean the light, the sun is coming from the east side, I'm going to put in the pure white. I'm using pure white out of the tube to put these forms in. This is the triangle at the very top. When you use the reference that you have in front of you, I can put this paint in very heavy. It's going to be a painting with a lot of texture, because I'm working fast and I need to be able to have a full impact of this very stark color scheme. Stark color schemes aren't always dark colors against light colors. They are sometimes light colors against light colors. And this is what this is. This is light colors against light colors, namely the shadows that are being cast on this fully white church. I can't imagine the nightmare of having to paint this church whenever it needs painting, because it looks to me like an endless job. On the note of endless, I'm going to take a slight break here, clean up my brushes, so I'll be right back. Here we are, back once again. While there was a break, I did a little bit of filling in here because I'm always a little bit concerned that the interest is going to wane somewhat when I do something which may not be as dramatic or as interesting as shows sometimes are. We are so spoiled by the fast-moving, extraordinary action that takes place on television programs that to actually test one's public about remaining interested in these in something like filling in great spaces of color is a problem and a concern to me. But most of the people who write to me, and let me take this opportunity right now to thank everyone who writes me letters asking for that for my sheet of what to buy and how to start, is very gratifying, and I wish that I would be able to find the time to answer all of those letters, but I don't, and here's the time that I want to do it. Anyway, the business of keeping the interest alive when the competition with television programs is so vast that I find that I have to hope that my audience is going to be interested enough to keep watching, despite the fact that, as in all endeavors in our lives, there are low spots and high spots. Now, I have never found it a problem to remain interested in applying paint to canvas, probably because I'm somewhat possessed by it. But people who are just watching this, maybe just for entertainment, will find that maybe we'll find it something more interesting on some other channel. However, it is fondly hoped that I can count on people bearing with me to do what I'm doing right now, namely to be putting in areas of color which are vital to the final thing. The drama, of course, will come when the shadows get put in and suddenly the building takes on a different form and it takes on some more interest. Here is I hope that the camera can pick up the slight gradation between the gray and the white here, because the front of this building, of this tower here, oops, don't go too far down, is slightly grayer than the sunlit side, but it isn't very much grayer. So as I say, you have to deal with great subtle changes in color, not like landscapes where green is green and the blue is for the water is blue and so on. Here you've got a very subtle bunch of nuances going for you. I'm tinting the color with a little bit with a touch of ivory black, and maybe just a little soupçon of blue. There I am with the Julia Child thing again, soupçon, as it were. And the grays should be made with a touch of blue, because we are, after all, reflecting the sky. Here are the slight grays of the facade of this tower. This should be a little bit grayer. And the shadows I'm going to start to put in right away, so that we can all get a pretty quick picture of how it all begins to change as the shadows are applied. Doing a rendering of a building such as this is can have many lives to it. The people are very attached to any number of structures. Structures that people are attached to are churches, their own houses, and funky places like barns and places that have a romantic appeal. So I always find that when you do these renderings, they can become part of a personal collection. I know an awful lot of people who are attached or who have bonded with things like barns and tumble-down places. Bridges are also extraordinarily well thought of and treasured in people's memories. People go to New England and they come back and they don't talk about the statue of Paul Revere in the middle of the square in Boston. They talk about that wonderful bridge that spans a little creek that is barely visible on a map. So if you decide that you want to do paintings of places, find the places that have appealed to you in the past and that you have remembered fondly, because you can always go back to the big spectacular ones at any time. However, the little places that you may never go back to are the ones that should be captured. I have now mixed some more of the ultramarine blue and a touch of some ivory black in the white, and here is the way the building will begin to take some kind of form, because all form is light and shade. We are now I've dealt with some of the light, and I'm hoping that this will now suddenly become quite self-explanatory about how you choose it. The interesting thing is that you have to believe what you see. You have to believe that the darkness of this shadow is actually so. It is, after all, a pure white church. But when the shadows are intense, that white becomes, well, maybe 12 or more shades deeper than what it is, and that is the challenge that every painter faces, to believe what he's looking at. He, she, whatever. Here is the deepness of those tones, and you still believe that this is, in fact, a white church with these extremely dark shadows being cast upon it. Well, look at the size of this shadow. This shadow tells you that there is a very large overhang from this little tower pent roof here because of the deepness of the shadow. Then there's also a shadow running down. One of those columns is casting this shadow here. A little bit wiggly, but this is just a demonstration, nothing for publication in a magazine. Here is also the deep gray being cast by the overhang on this tower. And then there's another deep shadow underneath here, and casting shadows in those windows, which are here. I'll get a smaller brush from that, but I believe there are 4 of them. Before I'm called by that fellow that counts windows with me, I got to make sure that I got the right amount of little windows in there. The signal has come that time is running out, which means that part 1 is, well, it's not too far along, but it's okay. It's the beginning. And the part 2 will, of course, will be the final exciting conclusion of this particular study, of this lovely gem of a church way out there on the eastern end of Long Island, which is, of course, probably one of the best reasons to go and take the Montauk Point ferry and pass through Northville and catch the act of this lovely, this little, really an architectural gem of a church. There is no question about it. In my opinion, maybe you'd like to go out and check this out yourself, and then write to me. I'm always delighted to get mail from people who have been watching this show and who do, in fact, use me as a teacher and go and seek out these places and then find out what I have found out through my observation, and maybe even open doors for other people. As you know, I do a live show on Tuesdays, the last Tuesday of every month, and then I do these tapings, which you see periodically throughout the week. I have found out that I am shown a great deal more than I thought, that I am on the air many, many times, maybe even anywhere between 4 and 9 times a week. This program of the Cable Easel is shown. So if you're not getting a bulletin and you're not quite sure when I'm on, there's no reason why you can't call the station and ask for a schedule. The people here are very accommodating and very helpful, and will probably be more than glad to give you the schedule of this program. I'm not sure that they'll give you a schedule for all the programs, but at least a specific one for this one is a good idea. These angles that I'm showing you were all drawn in first, of course, to tell you about the time of day and to show you that without these shadows you would probably get nothing more than, well, than just a bunch of triangles and rectangles all sort of jumbled together in some sort of a form. But with the shadows, it tells you what sticks out and what recedes and what is and exactly what you're looking at. To decipher all this stuff is sometimes a problem. The best way to be helped is with the shadows. So the shadows, of course, as I said to you, are a combination of ultramarine blue, some ivory black, and a base of white. I'll be signing off almost immediately. So before I do, let me thank you for watching. Thank you for writing the letters that you write. I'm not able to answer them all, but the ones that I do get, I'm really delighted to get. Thank you. Watch again if you can. This is Pat Windrow signing off on part 1 of the First Parish Church of Northville, Long Island.